Good morning, church. Today we'll be reading from Joshua 10, verses 1 to 28. Please read along in your Bible or on the screen. As soon as Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had captured Ai and had devoted it to destruction, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. He feared greatly, because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities, and because it was greater than Ai, and all its men were warriors. So Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, said to Hoam, king of Hebron, to Piram, king of Jarmuth, to Japhiah, king of Lachish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, "Come up to me and help me, and let us strike Gibeon, for it is made peace with Joshua and with the people of Israel." Then the 5 kings of the Amorites, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon, gathered their forces and went up with all their armies and encamped against Gibeon and made war against it. And the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp in Gilgal, saying, "Do not relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the kings of Amorites who dwell in the hill country are gathered against us." So Joshua went up from Gilgal. He had all the people of war with him and all the mighty men of valour. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you." So Joshua came up them suddenly, having marched up all night from Gilgal, and the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent of Beth Horon, and struck them as far as Azekah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down to the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord threw down large stones from heaven on them as far as Azekah, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. At that time Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still and the moon stopped, until the nation took a vengeance on their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jasher? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There has been no day like it before or since, when the Lord heeded the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel. So Joshua returned, and all Israel with him, to the camp of Gilgal. These 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave of Makkedah, and it was told to Joshua, "The 5 kings have been found, hidden in the cave at Makkedah." And Joshua said, "Roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men by it to guard them. But do not stay there yourselves. Pursue your enemies, attack their rear guard. Do not let them enter their cities, for the Lord your God has given them into your hand." When Joshua and the son of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities, then all the people returned safe to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah. Not a man moved his tongue against any of the people of Israel. Then Joshua said, "Open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave." And they did so, and brought those 5 kings out to him from the cave, the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And when they brought those kings out to Joshua, Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chief of the men of war who had gone with him, "Come near, put your feet on the necks of these kings." Then they came near and put their feet on their necks. And Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fought. And afterward Joshua struck them and put them to death. He had hung them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. But at the time of going down of the sun, Joshua commanded, and they took them down from the trees and threw them into the cave, where they had hidden themselves, and they set large stones against the mouth of the cave, which remain to this very day. As for Makkedah, Joshua captured it on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He devoted to destruction every person in it. He left none remaining. And he did to the king of Makkedah just as he had done to the king of Jericho.
Excuse me. Thank you, Bryony, for reading that long passage, bravely reading that long passage with all of its really interesting Hebrew names and so forth. A particularly good challenge for the Bible reader of the day. But it's important. I think it's great that we could have the whole story read for us. It's an incredible story. It's a great passage to have as a challenge to preach from. Because it's a wonderful story. What happens, the events of this are, it's a story about an incredible victory for God and an incredible victory for his people, the people of Israel. But it doesn't stand alone. It's not just there as the study of an incredible, the story, the insight into an incredible victory. It's part of a larger narrative arc. An important part of that larger narrative arc. And what do I mean by that? Well, this story fits into a series of episodes that are all very closely knit together. And if you'll allow me just to take a big step back for a moment and looking at the larger context of not just this story, but the episodes of which it's a part. Go back to chapter 5. And of course, in chapter 5, we have the reconsecration of the people of Israel after they've crossed over, come into the promised land, coming into this new place with the challenges that they face, reconsecration of the people of Israel. And this interesting encounter between Joshua and the captain or the angel of the Lord's army. And then on the other end, there's chapter 12, which is a summary, really clearly a summary of the battles and the victories and the conquest of the land of Canaan by the people of Israel. And if you step back and you look at it that way, and now let's just acknowledge for a moment that the chapter and verse, certainly the chapter breaks for us, can be a little distracting. And the Bible wasn't originally written that way. When this story was originally told and written, didn't have chapters 1 through however many, or verse numbers to go with the verses. It was just a story. And the way that people understood how the bigger story broke into smaller stories didn't have anything to do with chapter breaks. It had to do with other signals in the text, in the story itself, that helped them to discern, okay, we're on a new pathway here, or we're into a new episode. Excuse me. So, chapter 5, really obvious as a significant break in the overall flow of the story because of the reconsecration and because of Joshua's encounter with the angel. And what does the angel say? Very important, very telling. Joshua says, "Are you fighting for us or are you fighting against us?" And the angel says, "No." And explains, well, he doesn't really explain, but he says, "No, I am the captain of the Lord's army, and take off your sandals because the place where you're standing is sacred ground." In other words, consecrate yourself. It's a very significant act. It's not explained, but it's exactly the mirror of Moses before the burning bush, speaking to Yahweh for the first time, being commanded to do the same thing. You are being consecrated. You are being set apart for a very special task. So make yourself appropriate for that task. And in this instance, really, this is God signaling to Joshua, this is not about you fulfilling your plan, and the people of Israel fulfilling their plan, their aspirations, their dreams, their desires, so forth. This is about me and my plan. I have a plan here. I have a purpose. And the question becomes not, will I serve to fulfill your purpose, Israel, but are you in line? Do you line up with? Do you align with my purpose? And so that's the introduction then to this next series of battles that take place, all the way through chapter 11 up to 12, where it's all summarized. And so you can see there's a bit of an arc to this narrative. And what happens between 5 and 12 then becomes really significant in unpacking that first and initial challenge to Joshua, which is, do you line up with God? Does Israel and its intentions and its acts line up with God and what He's doing? And as you follow through, as we follow through those next episodes, sometimes yes and sometimes no, right? It's not all, it's a mixed result. There's the Jericho, get off to a really good start with a whopping victory and a very miraculous kind of victory, and that's a wonderful example. And then there's Ai, and that's not so good. And there's the Gibeonites, and what's going on with that? It's a very ambiguous kind of thing. In fact, I'd like to suggest that the passage that you looked at last week, the covenant with the Gibeonites, is really, in terms of the arc of this narrative, is really a failure, even arguably a significant failure by Israel. Because if you look in chapter 7 of Deuteronomy, God says, about these very people, Gibeonites are a Canaanite people. About these very people, God says, do not make covenants with them. And because of the consequences of that later on if you do. And that's exactly what Israel does. Joshua does. He makes a covenant with the people of Gibeon. Now, granted, they're tricked into it. But as Peter noted last week, they didn't seek the counsel of the Lord. So I think we're meant to understand, as these episodes fit together in an arc that is leading to a point, an overall point, we're meant to see the arrangement with the Gibeonites as one example of the failure of Israel. Israel does not line up with the will and the purposes of God. But, and this is important, wonderfully, there is a plan B. The covenant with the Gibeonites is not God's plan A, but he accommodates the move. Because, as the Israelites recognize, they've made a solemn oath. It's not something they can go back on. And so God accommodates that. He accepts the compromise and moves on. And the very next battle, the very next story then, is perhaps the climax, the highlight, and the most important victory of all of the passage. So what's happening here is these are the gradual steps of Israel learning to align itself with God's purposes. And interestingly, because I think the climax of this is in chapter 10, where God holds the sun and the moon in the sky so that the army of Israel can complete its task, its challenge of defeating the 5 kings of the Amorites, defeating their armies and driving them out. Because I think that's the climax. Each of the steps leading up to that are actually steps in a progressive movement. So even though some of these episodes look like failures, and they are in a limited sense, they're part of an overall movement of growth and understanding. Until we get to chapter 10, and I think this wonderful, and really, if you stop and think about it, incredible passage, statement, verse 14, where God, well, first of all, just before that, where it explains God holding the sun in the sky, the sun and the moon in the sky. And in my Bible, so because I'm a bit of a Bible nerd, I'm using the NASB. I realize most of us don't do that any longer. But in my version, and maybe in your English version, the text breaks into poetic form. Because in the original version, this short series of verses is stated in poetic form. It's a poem. And it says in verse 12, at the end, or halfway through verse 12, sun stands still at Gibeon, and moon at the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation avenged themselves of their enemies. And the reason I think it's important to see that that part is stated as poetry is because it's memorable. It's put in a form that's easy to remember. And it becomes a kind of proverb, a proverbial sort of poem for the people of Israel. In fact, this is the thing that's referred to in Jewish tradition and literature extensively from this point in time on. And it's just like we say, a stitch in time saves nine. Well, actually, probably not many of us say that anymore. It's a very old-fashioned saying. But the point is, it's easy to remember because it's got a rhyme to it, right? So that's the point of putting this passage in a poetic form so that it can be easily remembered. It needs to be easily remembered because it's very, very significant. And it becomes then the signal statement of Israel's learning to align itself with God and his purposes through this period of the conquest of the land of Canaan. And it's followed as a kind of endorsement by the next part, and verse 14, which says, there was no day like that before or after it, when the Lord listened to the voice of a man. And don't let that verse escape your notice. When the Lord listened to the voice of a man. You see what's happening here. You see where we've arrived. The heart of Joshua and the heart of God are now like this. They're one. And so Joshua intuitively understands and commands the people of Israel to obediently do exactly what God himself is about doing. And just as a kind of an aside, if there's any question about who, in a sense, is really in control here, who's really in charge here, you remember that little point, that little comment that's made a little earlier on where God brings hailstones against the fleeing Amorites. And the narrator actually makes the point, God killed more Amorites with the hailstones than the Israelite army killed by its soldiers. That's not an aside. That's an important way of the narrator acknowledging God didn't need the Israelite army to win this victory and to win this battle, or to drive the Canaanites out of their Amorites out of their cities and so forth. It was entirely in his hand. But now, Israel and God are at the same purpose. They're lined up together. And when they are in alignment, a man like Joshua can ask the Lord to hold the sun in the sky, and he will. And he does. Now, I think incredible point. And what happens from this point on then through the rest of chapter 10 and into verse 11 or chapter 11 are a series of fairly quickly described victories, one after another. Resounding victories for Israel. And don't miss this, again, bear with the Bible nerd here, but toward the end of chapter 11, it mentions how the Israelites defeat the Anakim. And who are the Anakim? The Anakim are the giants. They are the descendants of the Nephilim, the giants of the land. And they are the descendants of the very giants who the spies of Moses first identified when they went into the land of Canaan, and who they were terrified of. They came back, except for two. They came back and they said, "Look, we really shouldn't go to war with these people because they're giant, they're huge. They made us look like grasshoppers." These, at the end of chapter 11, these Anakim are the descendants of those very people. And what does Israel do? It wipes them out. So you notice the turn, the shift that's taken place here. No longer is Israel afraid of the giants. It's victorious over them. It wins these battles significantly. And it's again, I think you see the alignment now and how that has been achieved. And when that alignment exists, then someone like Joshua can call upon the Lord to hold the sun in the sky, and God will do it. He will act on their behalf. But what we also need to notice is that didn't just happen. That happened as a result of a series of events and developments through the narrative arc of these episodes together in this section that show how Israel had to learn to line its heart up with God's, and particularly how Joshua had to learn to discern the will of God and the purpose of God. And this is, I think, I'll just make a little sort of aside in terms of our own spirituality and how things tend to go. I think this is an important point. I'll come back to this, but it's a very indicative of just how this works against our kind of unstated expectations. We will tend to approach a challenge or a threat or a big opportunity or a transition, some big moment of our lives, and we will lay our requests before the Lord in prayer. More often than not, our plan, our version of what we want to see happen. And we will ask God to bless it. Do this for me, God. And we may couch that in a variety of ways, and they're not illegitimate, they're not wrong, and then they're entirely natural, really. In some respects, you can see that right here. But we put our plan before God, and we ask Him to bless it. And what these stories are showing us is that's not how it actually works. How it actually works is God teaches us through those experiences to align our hearts with His, and to discern and to understand progressively what He wants and needs us to understand about His purposes, maybe His purposes for our own lives. And it's as those things line up that then when we go to the Lord with a request, He will grant it. Maybe even miraculously, but in a way that is consonant with the alignment of our heart with His. I'll come back to that. And I want to make another comment from the text at this point because of this particular battle. The chapter begins, actually, one nice thing about Joshua is most of these chapter breaks actually do work pretty well in terms of the episodes of the narrative. So at the beginning of chapter 10, first verse, now it came about when Adoni-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that Joshua had captured Ai and had utterly destroyed it, just as he'd done to Jericho and its king. So he had done to Ai, etc., etc. Adoni-Tzedek. This is, again, maybe not so immediately obvious to us, but if we can kind of move now from the text to the audience, the first instance, original audience of this text, the people of Israel. The people of Israel who are living in exile in Babylon. The people of Israel in the period of the Second Temple who are even maybe living in Palestine but occupied by foreign powers. The dispossessed people of Israel. Long after this story and the larger section of the stories of which Joshua forms a part, basically after things have fallen apart, they've been sent into exile and maybe have returned to Palestine, but still disenfranchised, dispossessed, under the power of foreign authorities and foreign kings. That audience, listening to this story, they hear the name Adoni-Tzedek, king of Jerusalem, and what do they think of immediately? Who was another famous king of Jerusalem, whose name is actually fairly close. We say Melchizedek, kind of run it all together. But if you say it in a sense like this one here, it's Melchi-Tzedek, Adoni-Tzedek. They're very, again, if you're hearing those names and you know them really well, or you know the first one really well, and you would, then the second one will catch your attention. Because in Hebrew, it is almost as close to the same meaning as Melchi-Tzedek as you can get without actually reproducing the name. Melchi-Tzedek, my king is righteous. Adoni Tzedek, my Lord is righteous, roughly. And so for the audience hearing this story, they're saying, whoa, Adoni Tzedek, king of Jerusalem. But he is an Amorite who raises his sword against the people of Israel. And the point of that, in a very neat and a very concise literary way, is that this is a picture of how far the people of Canaan, the Canaanites, have fallen in the time between Melchizedek and Adoni-Tzedek. Melchizedek, who in virtually the same place, after a significant battle in which Abraham is part of a successful defeat of another series of kings, Melchizedek does what? He comes out and he blesses Abraham, the father of the Israelites. Blesses him, makes a friendly gesture and creates this bond with Abraham and blesses him, abundantly blesses him. And he's set up to be a picture of exactly what his name says, my king is righteous. So it is with a great ironic twist that this Adoni-Tzedek then appears at this point in the story as just the opposite. He isn't the righteous Lord of Jerusalem. He is the fallen Canaanite, wicked, cruel, evil, you add your negative adjective in there, of Jerusalem, who now, generations later, have become so corrupt that their first response to the people of Israel is to raise up the sword and to take arms against them, to oppose them. And so his overthrow is it's pointing to the greater picture of why God is at work against the Canaanite people, because they are a corrupt people. They are a vicious people. They're a cruel people. They're a violent people, and so forth and so on. In chapter 18 of Leviticus and chapter 12 of Deuteronomy, there are criticisms of the Canaanites for their sexual corruption and for their child sacrifice. Really, really nasty things. That is representative of these people. And you see it in a nutshell in this particular king here. So stepping back, that audience, those people of Israel, living in exile, living under foreign domination, they're seeing this story. They're hearing this story. And what is it saying to them? Well, I think it's quite a powerful message, because they're recognizing we, as the people of God, have fallen away from God, have suffered the consequences of everything he warned us way back then would happen if we didn't do what he said in the first place, and if we didn't hold tightly to the covenant. And having failed to uphold the covenant, our part of the covenant, we are now living with the dreadful consequences of that over generations. But there is hope. Because just as the Israelites in the first instance had to go through a process of discovery and of alignment where they learned how to read and understand the heart of God and line themselves up with that and made failures along the way, some of them grave, God was patient, and he worked with them through that process to the extent that finally Joshua can call upon him to hold the sun in the sky, and he does. And so the message for the people of Israel now on the other end of the fall, their fall as a people, they can look back and they're reminded through these stories that God is still the one with the purpose. And they're not in alignment with that purpose, but they can become in alignment with that purpose. Again, they can line themselves back up. And the wonderful underlying hope is that not only will God patiently allow them to work through whatever it takes for them to get to that point, it's possible that when they align, there will be a man who can ask God to hold the sun in the sky. and he will. And of course, those Jews at a later time, they don't know who this man is, but they know he is Messiah. And they know he is promised, and he will come. And they may or may not, at this point, or the point in which they're hearing this for the first time, quite get the point that it's going to take them some time to line up with God's purposes so that this can all happen. But the underlying hope is unmistakable. It's there for them. And because I want to honor the kind of grammatical and narrative logic of this text, this is a text that's a story that's given for the people of Israel as a people, as a community. And because we are the people of God in our era, I want to step back and take a look at this for us quickly, because I think it's really important. And this gives me a chance to speak as a real missionary now too. But don't mistake the fact that as the people of God, as the church, the message for us is exactly the same. That as the people of God, to the extent that our hearts, that we seek to know the will of God and his purposes, and we offer ourselves to line up with his purposes, we give our hearts to line up with his heart and his purposes, that we can actually expect him to hold the sun in the sky if we ask him to. And I think, and here I'm speaking entirely as a missionary now, I think that's exactly what we see. I don't think we commonly think of it that way. It maybe escapes our notice, but we all have far too much information available to us in our day and age for our well-being, for us to be able to sleep at night. We know too much about what's going on in the world. We know about the cruelty and the violence and the evil and the wickedness of the world that we live in. And not just out there. You don't have to look very far at all for the information about all that to be right in your face. Enough to keep us up at night sometimes. But we, as much as we want God to judge all of that, and for Christ to return, and for God to put an end to it all, he hasn't. And according to what Jesus tells his followers in chapter 24 of Matthew's gospel, Jesus answering that very question, when will the end come? When? And I myself get impatient. I'm ready. Well, more or less ready, except as Jesus said to his followers, this gospel of the kingdom must be preached as a witness, as a testimony. You understand, that's a legal phrase, as a testimony to all the nations. It works both ways. It's the access to the gospel that they all need, but it's also a witness against them for their sinfulness where they reject it. This gospel of the kingdom must be preached to all the nations, and then the end will come. And that's the gap that we live in at this time, at our time. And I know this because of the focus of my professional life. We actually live in the golden era of global missions. There are more missionaries from more places in the world, serving in more places in the world, testifying to the gospel to more and progressively more nations. And the number of remaining nations is really getting very few than at any time in the history of the world. You might not feel like this is a spiritual high water mark for the gospel, but believe me, from what I hear, it is. Places like Iran, the fastest growing church in the world. Places like North Africa and the Middle East. Places where people cannot openly testify to the gospel. God is just supervening all of that and bringing them the gospel in dreams and visions and through miraculous encounters. And I'm not talking about ones and twos or dozens. Thousands of people having these incredible experiences of Jesus appearing to them and basically telling them who he is. That's the era in which we live. And so if it feels like the end is taking a long time to come, as a missionary, I think it's because God is holding that sun in the sky for us until the job is done. And to the extent that we as his people are lined up with that purpose, we can ask him for an awful lot within that broad understanding. We can ask him for an awful lot. I'll give you an example. Again, where I think empirically we see this. 2020, the COVID crisis strikes, and we as a mission leadership are looking at SIM and our finances, our missionary numbers, and we're braced for survival. We're planning how we're going to try to keep the mission alive through the period of however long this crisis is going to last, it's going to take. And we're kind of expecting the worst. And guess what? The worst never came. And it wasn't just our mission, but our colleagues in other missions report almost exactly the same statistics. And not just in Australia, but our SIM offices around the world. In that first year of COVID, we saw a roughly 7 to 8% increase in our mission finances. At a time when churches were struggling to pay pastors and money was tight, even among Christians, we had an increase in giving and an increase in the numbers of missionaries prepared to go overseas for overseas service. The big problem we had in 2020 and 2021 is we couldn't get people out of Australia to go to the places that they were ready to serve in. It was completely the opposite problem of the one that we expected. And that was true from 2020 virtually until the present. Steady, incremental, unmistakable increase in finance and missionary numbers across evangelical missions, across SIM globally. It was not what we expected. But I think it just makes the point that this simply must be important to God. And so it's going to happen. And it happened even contrary to our expectations and our planning. We weren't lined up with God's purpose to that extent. But we pretty quickly rallied to line ourselves back again with God because he was going to do it. And he was inviting us to continue to be a part of that. That is the picture of God holding back the sun in the sky until we, as his people, with him, partnering with him, fulfill something that's very important to his heart. But I think there's one more point to be made here. That's us as a people of God. And let's understand, I think in the first instance, that's how this passage, the stories are meant to be taken. But it does work for us personally, as individual believers as well. And here, I will go to Matthew chapter 28. Missionary speaker, you knew I was going to have to weave the Great Commission in there somehow. I think it fits here, legitimately. Where Jesus tells his small group of followers, his close disciples, as you go, make disciples of all nations. I'm going to abbreviate this so you get the full force of the point. As you go, make disciples of all nations, and I will be with you, he says to his followers. There's a direct connection between the command, and the only actual command there is to make disciples. Make disciples of all nations. As you go, make disciples of all nations, and I will be with you. You see the point, the connection. We hear the last part of that at the end of that much longer passage, and I will be with you even to the end of the age. We think, yeah, this is wonderful. Jesus promising to be with his followers always, everywhere, under all circumstances. And that's true. There's no sense in which that's not true. But the point of that passage is, as you go and make disciples, I will be with you. And we're meant to see that there's a very special sense in which if we are lining up to what's important to Jesus, if our hearts are in step with his heart, we will know his presence with us in a very special way. And so I think practically the challenge here then is this for us. We will approach these challenges, these opportunities, these transitions, these moments of our life with a keen desire to want to ask God to bless our plans, our intentions, our dreams, our ambitions. maybe well-informed and well-intentioned. And the counter response from God is the invitation for us to ask him the question, but what's really important to him? Lord, if you help me to get the scores that I need, I will study medicine and I will serve you as a doctor. Beautiful prayer, wonderful invitation. But the open-handed response to God may simply be, Lord, at this point of my life, as I look forward with what's in front of me, what do you want? What do you want me to do? I think I could be a good doctor and I could serve you as a Christian. What do you want me to do? Lord, with the finances that I now have at this point of my life, I will give 10% of that to you. Show me how to use that 10% to fulfill your purposes, to bless people, to further the gospel, whatever. What if we say, Father, everything I have comes to me from you. Show me what to do with it. All of it. It's yours. How can I line up with your purpose? And that's a scary invitation to make, I'll warn you. Speaking as someone who left the United States at the age of 27 to go serve as a missionary in Ethiopia, with all that that entailed, it's a scary question. It's a scary invitation to make, genuinely make, open-heartedly. But if we want to be the followers of God, who can then turn around and ask him, literally, to hold the sun in the sky, or whatever the equivalent is for us in our lives, in our world, we need to be like this. And this is still a bit fresh for me and for us, but I really feel like my friendship with Steve Rose gave me an insight into a life that at the end of it was willing to ask that question and make that invitation. When Steve and Diane got that diagnosis, that it was cancer and it was very serious, and it was a real prospect that there wasn't going to be a living outcome to this event. I know that their prayer was, Father, glorify yourself in our lives and death. Open-handed, open-hearted, open. A willingness to align their hearts with God's heart. Sorry for putting you on the spot, Diane, but it needs to be said. A willingness to line their hearts up with God's in a way that allowed God to do just that, to glorify himself. Most of us would be, let's be honest, we would be saying, God, if you spare me this cancer, or if you help me to survive this, I will do this for you, I will do that for you, I will give this to you, I will serve you in this way and that way. How many of us can say, even in my death, Father, I give it back to you. My heart to your heart. Do what is best. And trust him to do that. And he did. And he did glorify himself in that life and in that death. I don't think there's any better picture of exactly what this story is telling us about. And so my invitation and challenge to you, to each one of you is, are you willing to extend that invitation to God? Whatever it is you're facing now in your life, whether it's an opportunity, a transition, a challenge, a threat, whatever it is, are you willing to say, I'm here to serve your purposes. I want my heart to line up with your heart. And then to look for the way in which God will hold back the sun in the sky for you. Let me pray. Father, I guess we have to be honest with you that to put it in this way is pretty confronting for each one of us. We naturally want to believe that we're on track with you and that we are fulfilling your purposes and we are serving you in our lives and we are a living testimony to an alignment between our heart and your heart. And maybe we are, and maybe we aren't. And Lord, what I pray is that none of us here as your people will ever take that for granted. That we as your people, as your community of your people, this church, your church, won't assume that we are so in line with your purposes, that we can expect miracles from you. But we do pray that you will teach us what it means and give us the patience to work through the steps required to line our hearts up with yours as your people and as individual believers. And I do pray, Father, that along with all of that, you would give us the faith, the growing faith that is capable of recognizing you working in the subtle, in the quiet, in the unnoticed ways, as much as we look for the dramatic and the miraculous and the big ways. And whether we see those things clearly in our lives or not, simply to be in such close step with your Spirit that we don't even need to see the big miracles. We just know you're right, and we want to be a part of what's right. Bless us with the faith and the trust and the courage that is required for us to be that kind of a people. And thank you for the promise that you've given us that that's exactly what you will do relentlessly. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing with us.